The wind was sharp that morning, sweeping across the open plains and bending the tall grass, carrying the dry scent of sage and earth. The sky stretched endlessly above, pale blue and clear, with the rising sun casting long golden shadows. The land was quiet except for the creak of an old windmill and the soft shuffle of boots on gravel. That was when I first saw her. She stood leaning against a weathered fence post, one hand on the brim of her hat, the other resting on the strap of a rifle slung over her shoulder. At a glance she looked ordinary, just another ranch hand in scuffed boots, faded jeans, and a plaid shirt that had seen years of wear. Her hair was tucked beneath her hat, and her face was shaded so I couldn't see much of it, but there was something about the way she stood, so still, so calm, that caught my attention. She didn't seem like someone who was passing time, she seemed like someone waiting for something to happen. When she finally looked up, her eyes caught mine, and I felt the sharpness in that gaze. It wasn't hostile, but it was assessing, like she was measuring me in silence. I had been sent out early to check the fences and keep the cattle moving. My uncle's ranch stretched for miles, and most days I worked alone, with only the rumble of the old Chevy pickup and the distant sound of cattle for company. I wasn't expecting anyone to be out there. I nodded a greeting, and she returned the gesture with the faintest dip of her head. She didn't speak, and I didn't either. I went about moving the cattle, but I couldn't help glancing her way every few seconds. She stayed motionless, leaning on the post like a sentry, her rifle catching the sunlight as it swayed slightly with the wind. After a while, she shifted, lifting her chin to watch something I couldn't see yet. I followed her gaze and spotted a hawk circling high above. She tracked it with her eyes, her face calm but focused. When she moved, it was quick and smooth. She swung the rifle up and rested it against her shoulder, but she didn't fire. She just watched through the scope, then lowered it again and looked back at me. Her expression didn't change. "You're new here," she said finally, her voice low and steady, with a faint drawl that made it hard to guess where she was from. "Yeah," I said, a little surprised she'd spoken. "Helping my uncle for the summer." She nodded once like that explained everything. "East fence has a weak spot about a mile down," she said. "You been checking the fences?" I asked, frowning. "Every morning," she said simply, shifting her weight but not offering more. That was odd. Nobody else came out this far, not unless they had a reason. I nodded, unsure what else to say, and she gave me one last look before turning and walking away. She moved with purpose, boots crunching on the dirt as she headed toward the tree line, the rifle swaying at her side. I thought about her all day while I worked, and when I got back to the house, I asked my uncle if he'd hired someone new. He frowned and shook his head. "Ain't got the money for new help," he said. "Why?" "Just thought I saw someone checking fences," I said carefully. He shrugged, uninterested, and changed the subject. The next day, I saw her again, sitting on the split-rail fence near the west pasture. She was crouched low, elbows resting on her knees, watching the herd with an intensity one couldn't explain. I didn't approach her this time, just nodded as I passed, and she nodded back. It became routine after that. Every day, I'd see her somewhere on the land, sometimes leaning against a post, sometimes crouched in the grass, always with that rifle. She didn't talk much, only gave small bits of advice about where the cattle were wandering or which section of fence needed repair. I never saw her near the barns or house, never saw her with anyone else. It was like she belonged to the land itself, moving silently through it, watching everything. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned orange and purple, I saw her near the corral. The horses were restless, tossing their heads and pawing at the dirt, but she stood calm, one hand on a gelding's neck, whispering something I couldn't hear. The horse stilled under her touch, and I approached slowly, not wanting to spook them. She glanced at me, her expression unreadable. "You ride?" she asked. "Some," I said. She gave a small nod and handed me the reins. I saddled the horse while she watched, silent and steady. When I swung into the saddle, she mounted her own horse, and without a word we rode out together, the sound of hooves thudding softly against the dirt. She didn't speak, but there was a strange peace in the silence between us. We rode to a ridge that overlooked the valley, and she stopped, dismounted, and crouched near the edge. I followed her gaze and saw a dark shape near the tree line. "Coyotes," she said softly. "Been trailing the herd for days." I squinted but couldn't see clearly. She raised her rifle and looked through the scope, her breathing slow and even, her body still. After a moment, she lowered it. "Too far," she murmured. "They'll come closer tonight." We rode back in silence. That night I couldn't sleep, replaying the way she'd stood there, calm and patient, like a predator herself. She wasn't just some ranch hand. There was something deliberate about everything she did. At dawn, I found her crouched near the fence, studying tracks in the dirt. She looked up and motioned for me to stay quiet. I froze, and she pointed at a deep paw print. "Mountain lion," she whispered. "Big one." A shiver ran down my spine. She stood, lifting her rifle, and said softly, "Stay behind me." We followed the tracks cautiously, moving through the brush. The air was cool and still, carrying the faint musky scent of something wild. She walked like she'd done this 100 times, every step measured. When we finally saw the lion, crouched low and ready to spring at a calf, I felt my breath catch. It was massive, muscles rippling under tawny fur, golden eyes fixed on the herd. She didn't hesitate. She raised the rifle, fired once, and the lion dropped instantly. My hands were shaking, but she lowered the rifle and walked to the animal, crouching beside it. She murmured something I couldn't hear, a soft whisper like a prayer, then stood and walked back toward the ranch. I followed, silent and unsettled. Later, I found her near the barn, sitting on an overturned bucket, cleaning her rifle with slow, precise movements. I hesitated, then sat across from her. "You're good," I said quietly. She didn't look up. "Had to be. Military?" I asked cautiously. She paused, then resumed wiping down the barrel. "Once." I nodded slowly. She didn't seem like someone who wanted questions. After a long silence, I asked softly, "What's your name?" She glanced at me finally, her eyes sharp but calm. "Call me Widow," she said. The word felt heavy, final, and it explained everything I'd seen in her, the stillness, the skill, the sadness she never showed but carried everywhere. The name stayed with me like a whisper I couldn't shake. Widow. She didn't offer more, and I didn't ask, but the way she'd said it was enough to let me know there was a story behind it, a heavy one. After that morning, I started seeing her differently. She wasn't just some quiet figure on the edges of the range anymore. There was a purpose to her presence, a reason she was out there every day before sunrise and gone by nightfall. She moved through the land like she belonged to it, every step deliberate, every glance calculated. I tried to keep working as usual, checking fences, running the cattle, fixing the old pickup when it sputtered, but my thoughts kept circling back to her. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I found myself sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the dark fields. The stars stretched endless above, the sky so clear it felt like I could reach out and touch it. Somewhere out there, she was probably watching the land, maybe camping under the open sky. I wondered if she ever slept. I didn't hear her approach, but I felt her presence before I saw her. She stepped out of the shadows, rifle slung across her back, and leaned against the porch rail. I didn't move or speak, just waited, and she finally said, "They'll come back tonight." Her voice was low, steady, like she was talking about the weather, but I knew she meant the coyotes. I nodded, and she glanced toward the barn. "Stay near the calves. They'll go for them first." She disappeared into the darkness again, moving like a shadow, and I felt an unexpected chill despite the warm summer air. I followed her instructions, taking my uncle's old shotgun and positioning myself near the corral. The night stretched on, quiet and heavy, broken only by the occasional shuffle of cattle and the low hum of crickets. My eyes strained in the darkness, and I nearly jumped out of my skin when a shape emerged from the shadows near the tree line. It was her. She moved silently, crouched low, scanning the area with her rifle. She didn't acknowledge me, just slipped past like a ghost, vanishing again into the dark. Hours passed, and I started wondering if the threat had been in my head, but then I heard it, a low growl, soft but unmistakable. My pulse spiked, and I gripped the shotgun tighter. The cattle shifted nervously, their hooves thudding softly against the dirt. Another growl came, closer this time, and I caught movement in the brush. Before I could react, a sharp crack split the night. Her rifle. The sound echoed across the valley, and something yelped, then silence fell heavy and absolute. She stepped out of the darkness moments later, calm as ever, dragging the body of a coyote behind her. Without a word, she hauled it out past the fence and tossed it aside. She looked at me, her expression unreadable, and said, "That's one. There'll be more." Then she was gone again. I didn't sleep much that night. I couldn't stop thinking about her calmness, the way she moved, the way she seemed to know what was coming before it happened. The next morning, I found her by the windmill, sitting cross-legged on the ground, cleaning her rifle. She didn't look up as I approached. "Do you ever rest?" I asked. She gave a faint shrug. "Not much." I leaned against the fence, watching her work. "You ever gonna tell me why you're out here?" She paused, then said, keeping watch. I waited for more, but she stayed quiet. Finally, I asked softly, for what? She looked up then, her eyes sharp and tired all at once. Trouble. The word was simple, but it carried a weight I couldn't ignore. Over the next few days, I started noticing things I hadn't before. Boot prints in the dirt near the back gate. A broken branch near the water trough. A piece of wire cut clean from the fence. Someone had been here, and not just passing through. She'd been watching for more than coyotes. I started sticking closer to her, offering to ride with her when she checked the fences. She didn't say yes or no, just let me follow, and we'd spend hours riding the perimeter of the ranch in silence. She was always alert, scanning the horizon, pausing to crouch low and study tracks I wouldn't have noticed. One evening, as we were heading back, I finally asked, "You military?" She nodded once. "Long time ago. Special Forces." Another nod. "What happened?" She didn't answer right away. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land, and she seemed lost in thought. Finally, she said quietly, "Lost him overseas. Husband." The word hung in the air between us, heavy and raw. I didn't know what to say, so I stayed quiet. After a while, she added, "Came back here. Figured I'd keep watch where no one else will." That was all she said, but it was enough. I realized then that she wasn't just some drifter or ranch hand. She'd chosen this place, this job, because it gave her something to protect. That night, I joined her on watch. We sat near the corral, her rifle across her lap, my shotgun resting against my knee. The stars were bright overhead, the land quiet. She didn't talk much, but she didn't need to. There was something steadying about her presence, like she'd seen worse nights than this and made it through them all. Around midnight, we heard movement again, but this time it wasn't coyotes. She stiffened, raised a hand for me to stay still, and crouched low, scanning the shadows. I followed her gaze and saw them, two figures slipping through the dark near the back fence. My heart pounded as she quietly chambered around. "Rustlers," she whispered. I'd heard stories of cattle thieves hitting remote ranches, but I'd never expected it here. She motioned for me to stay put, then disappeared into the darkness, moving like a shadow. I gripped the shotgun, my palms slick with sweat, straining to see her in the dark. A few tense moments passed, then a sharp voice rang out. "Drop it." Her voice was steady, commanding, and I heard the rustle of movement, a curse, and then another voice shouting. Two shots cracked through the night, one from her rifle, one from a pistol. I ducked instinctively, heart hammering, but when I looked up, she was dragging one of the men toward me, his hands zip-tied behind his back. The other had fled into the darkness. She dumped the man at my feet and said, "Keep him here." Then she vanished again. Minutes later, she returned, calm as ever, rifle slung over her shoulder. "He won't be back," she said simply. She called the sheriff, and within an hour, the man was hauled off in handcuffs. My uncle was furious and shaken, demanding to know how long someone had been watching the ranch. Widow stayed silent, leaning against the porch rail with her arms crossed, eyes scanning the horizon like she expected more trouble. That night, when things had settled, I found her sitting alone near the corral, staring out at the dark fields. I sat beside her and said softly, "You saved us tonight." She didn't look at me, just said, "That's what I do." I studied her face, the lines of exhaustion and strength etched into it, and asked, "Why stay here? You could be anywhere." She finally turned to look at me, her eyes soft but tired. "Because trouble always comes where no one's looking." And I promised him I'd never let it take me by surprise again. There was a depth in her words that left me silent. We sat there together until dawn, the land bathed in gold as the sun rose over the horizon. For the first time, I understood why she called herself Widow. It wasn't just a name. It was a reminder, a vow, and a warning all in one. That the sheriff came back the next day with questions, but Widow stayed in the background, leaning against the barn wall with her arms crossed and her hat pulled low over her eyes. She spoke when spoken to, giving clipped answers in a calm tone, never revealing more than she needed to. The sheriff seemed to know her, though, or at least knew of her. He didn't press too hard, just nodded respectfully when she finished talking, as if he understood she wasn't someone you pushed. When he left, my uncle pulled me aside, his voice low and rough. "Who is she?" he demanded. I hesitated, glancing toward where she was now crouched by the fence line, studying something in the dirt. "She's watching the land," I said finally. My uncle snorted. "Watching the land? She's a damn sniper, that's what she is. You see the way she moved last night? like she'd done it all before. He shook his head and muttered, not sure if I should be grateful or scared. I didn't answer, because truthfully I wasn't sure either. Widow was a mystery wrapped in layers of silence and skill, but there was one thing I was certain of, she was here for a reason. Over the next week, she hardly spoke more than a few words at a time, but she never stopped moving. She fixed the weak spots in the fence herself, repaired a section of the windmill that had been squeaking for months, and set up a small camp on the ridge that overlooked the valley. It wasn't much, just a tarp, a bedroll, and a small fire pit, but it told me she planned to stay close. Every evening, I'd catch glimpses of her silhouette up there, sitting cross-legged with her rifle across her lap, scanning the land as the sun went down. Sometimes I'd bring her coffee, and she'd nod in thanks but say nothing. Sitting beside her in the fading light, listening to the wind whistle through the grass, I started to feel safer than I'd ever felt out there. One night, while I was saddling a horse for an early ride, she appeared in the barn doorway, silent as a shadow. "They'll come back," she said simply. I glanced up, startled. "The rustlers?" She nodded, stepping forward to tighten the strap on the saddle. "They always do. They think you're easy prey now. They saw the land, the herd, the weak spots. They'll try again." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. "You think they'll come soon?" "Tonight." She said it without hesitation, like she wasn't guessing, she knew. That night, we didn't sleep. Widow set up a position near the back fence, lying prone with her rifle, watching the dark. I stayed closer to the corral, shotgun in hand, nerves wound tight as a wire. Hours passed with nothing but the sound of wind and crickets, until I heard a faint rustle. I froze, heart hammering. Widow's voice cut softly through the dark. "Two of them. Left side." I strained my eyes but couldn't see a thing. Then, just as my breathing started to quicken, I saw a shadow move, a figure slipping low to the ground near the fence line. Widow didn't hesitate. The crack of her rifle shattered the silence, and the shadow dropped instantly. The other figure froze, then bolted toward the trees. Widow was already moving, sprinting with impossible speed, rifle in hand. I stumbled after her, but she was faster, melting into the darkness like smoke. By the time I reached the tree line, she had the man on the ground, her knee pressed into his back, his hands bound. Her calmness was unnerving, she didn't even look winded. She dragged him back to the house, tied him to a post, and called the sheriff. "They are testing us," she said, wiping her hands on her jeans. "They'll keep coming unless we end it." My uncle was pale and angry, muttering curses as he called in favors from other ranchers to keep watch for suspicious activity. Widow didn't look angry, just steady, like she'd expected this all along. "You've done this before," I said quietly as we walked back toward the ridge after the sheriff took the man away. "A few times," she said. "Afghanistan, Syria, Africa. Always the same story, people wanting what isn't theirs. You learn to see patterns." I looked at her, trying to imagine what she'd seen, what she'd done. "Why here?" I asked finally. She glanced out over the land, the fields glowing silver under the moonlight. "Because this place is quiet," she said softly. "Quiet until it's not." And I promised him I'd never let myself get caught off guard again. Not anywhere. There was pain in her voice, buried deep, and I didn't push her. We spent the rest of the night on that ridge, side by side, her rifle resting across her knees, my shotgun leaning against a rock. The world felt both vast and small up there, the night so still I could hear the cattle breathing in the valley below. When dawn broke, she finally spoke again. "They'll try one more time," she said. "Then they'll stop. They'll either get scared off, or they won't get back up." There was no threat in her tone, just certainty. And I believed her. Over the next few days, she turned the ranch into something resembling a forward operating base. She showed me how to set tripwires with old cans and fishing line, how to find the best vantage points, how to move silently across open terrain. She taught me how to shoot better too, correcting my grip and stance with a quiet patience that surprised me. My uncle grumbled about her methods but didn't stop her. He'd seen enough to know she was keeping us alive. On the fourth night, it happened. The tripwire cans rattled softly in the dark, and Widow was on her feet in an instant, rifle raised. I followed her lead, my pulse pounding in my ears. 3 figures this time, moving low and fast. Widow dropped the first one with a single shot, and chaos exploded. The second fired back, bullets whistling past us as we scrambled for cover. Widow moved like lightning, flanking him, her shots precise and deadly. The third tried to make a run for it, but I managed to fire and knock him down. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the shotgun, but Widow was already there, tying him up with zip ties she'd pulled from her pocket like she'd been expecting this exact outcome. When it was over, the air was thick with gunpowder and adrenaline. Widow stood over the two bound men, her expression unreadable. "They won't come back," she said finally. She was right. The sheriff arrived with backup, and the men were hauled away. Turns out they were part of a crew that had been hitting ranches for months, stealing cattle and equipment, selling them across state lines. Widow had been tracking them for weeks before they ever came near us. That night, after everything had quieted down, I found her sitting alone on the porch steps, hat in her hands, staring out at the fields. I sat beside her, unsure what to say. She didn't look at me, just said softly, "He would have liked this place." I knew she was talking about her husband. "You still miss him," I said quietly. She nodded, her eyes glistening in the moonlight. "Every day." There was nothing I could say to that, so I just sat with her, the silence between us heavy but comforting. She wasn't just protecting the land, she was keeping a promise, one that ran deeper than I could understand. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in gold and pink, I looked at her and realized she wasn't just a drifter, or a sniper, or a widow. She was a guardian, forged in loss and battle, who'd chosen this quiet patch of land to stand her ground. And as long as she was here, nothing would catch us off guard again. Life on the ranch settled into a strange new rhythm after the rustlers were caught. The sheriff's visits became less frequent, and the tension that had gripped my uncle's face started to fade, but Widow remained the same. She still spent her nights on the ridge, her rifle always within reach, her eyes scanning the horizon like she expected danger to rise from the earth itself. Even when the sheriff told us the crew had been dismantled and the remaining members arrested, she didn't relax. "There's always another threat," she said quietly one evening as we sat near the corral, watching the sun dip behind the hills. "Peace is just a pause between fights." There was no bitterness in her voice, just certainty, and I realized she'd lived too long in places where peace was a luxury. My uncle started relying on her more than he'd admit. When he needed a broken gate repaired, Widow had it fixed before dawn. When a storm knocked out power to the barns, she rewired the generator herself, working in the pouring rain with her sleeves rolled up and her hair plastered to her face. She never asked for thanks or recognition, but the ranch was running smoother than it ever had. She'd become part of it, though she still slept under the stars more often than under a roof. I started to see the way the land had shaped her, or maybe the way she'd shaped herself to fit the land. She knew every track in the dirt, every sound the wind made when it passed through the grass, every shadow cast by the hills at dawn and dusk. It was like she'd become a living part of the range, blending with it so perfectly that sometimes I'd lose sight of her, only to find her crouched silently a few yards away. One night, I couldn't sleep and wandered up the ridge to find her. She was lying on her stomach with the rifle propped against a rock, staring through the scope at nothing in particular. I lay down beside her, the ground cool beneath me, and asked softly, "Do you ever think about leaving?" She didn't answer right away, just adjusted the rifle slightly. "I did, once," she said finally. "Packed everything and got in the truck. Drove 3 states over. Thought I could start over." She paused, her eyes never leaving the scope. Turned around the next day. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was running from ghosts. "So I came back and made them face me here." Her words lingered in the quiet night air. I wanted to ask more, but something in her voice told me not to. Instead, I just lay there with her, staring out over the dark fields, the stars so bright they almost hurt to look at. It was strange how safe I felt with her nearby, even though she carried danger like a shadow. She never seemed afraid, not of rustlers, not of predators, not of anything. But sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, I'd catch a glimpse of the weight she carried in her eyes. The days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of the ranch carried on. Widow stayed, though no one asked her to. She worked side by side with me and my uncle, fixing fences, tending cattle, and keeping the place running, but she never stopped her nightly patrols. Sometimes I'd find her sitting in the barn, cleaning her rifle with methodical precision, or sharpening the knife she kept strapped to her boot. She was always preparing, always ready, as if danger could appear at any moment. And in a way, she was right. Trouble wasn't done with us yet. It came on a day that started like any other, with the sun rising over the fields and the smell of dust in the air. I was out near the far pasture, mending a section of fence, when I saw a glint of sunlight reflecting off glass in the distance. At first, I thought it was nothing, maybe just light bouncing off a car's windshield on the road, but then it happened again, and I realized the glint wasn't moving. Someone was out there, watching. I didn't have a radio, so I mounted my horse and rode hard back to the barn. Widow was already there, crouched by the truck with her rifle in hand, scanning the horizon. You saw it too, I said breathlessly. She nodded once, eyes narrow. Scope glare, she said. Sniper. My stomach dropped. Here. Not surprised, she said calmly, slinging the rifle over her shoulder. When you take down one crew, someone else always comes looking. Maybe revenge, maybe business. Doesn't matter. She motioned for me to follow her, and we moved low and fast toward the ridge. She handed me a pair of binoculars and pointed. Tree line, left side. 200 yards. I raised the binoculars and scanned the area. At first, I saw nothing but leaves and branches, but then I caught a flicker of movement, a figure crouched low with a rifle, watching the ranch. Got him, I whispered. Widow lay prone, her rifle steady on a rock. Stay low, she murmured. The air was tense and still. She adjusted her scope, breathing slow, her finger resting on the trigger. I held my breath, waiting. Then she fired. The crack echoed through the hills, and the figure slumped forward. Widow didn't move, didn't speak, just stayed in position, scanning for more. Minutes passed in silence before she finally lowered the rifle. One more, she said softly. I tensed, searching the tree line, and sure enough, another glint caught the sunlight farther left. Widow didn't hesitate. She shifted her aim, exhaled slowly, and fired again. Another body dropped. Clear, she said, her voice calm, steady. I stared at her, my heart racing. Who were they? I asked. She shrugged, standing and slinging her rifle over her shoulder. Could be leftovers from the crew. Could be mercenaries. Could be someone else entirely. Doesn't matter. They're gone. We made our way to the tree line, moving cautiously. She checked the bodies with a practiced efficiency, stripping their rifles and scanning their gear. Professional, she murmured. Not locals. Someone paid them. She glanced at me, her eyes sharp. This wasn't random. The thought sent a chill down my spine. Widow's expression hardened as she stood. We need to fortify. For the next 2 days, she turned the ranch into a fortress. She set up cameras, reinforced the gates, and positioned rifles in strategic spots. My uncle watched her with a mixture of awe and unease. She's turning this place into a damn military base, he muttered. But neither of us stopped her. She was right, this wasn't over. One evening, I found her sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the fields with a distant look in her eyes. I sat beside her quietly, and after a moment, she said softly, "They won't stop until someone makes them." Her voice was calm, but there was steel in it. "And you?" I asked. She glanced at me, her gaze steady. "I've been stopping people like this my whole life. This is nothing new." She leaned back against the post, her fingers absently tracing the scar that ran along her jawline. I wanted to ask her how she got it, but I didn't. She'd tell me in her own time, or not at all. That night, I joined her on watch. We sat in silence, rifles across our laps, the stars stretching endless above us. I realized then that Widow wasn't just guarding the ranch, she was guarding herself, keeping her promise to a man she loved and lost, and maybe trying to find peace in a world that had given her none. And I knew that as long as she stayed, no one would touch this land. The days after the ambush were heavy with tension, every sound of wind through the grass or creak of wood on the porch setting my nerves on edge, but Widow moved through the unease with the same calm precision she always carried. She tightened our defenses further, teaching me and my uncle how to hold rifles, how to move silently at night, and how to spot danger before it was close enough to strike. At first, my uncle resisted, grumbling about how this was a cattle ranch, not a war zone, but even he couldn't deny that Widow knew what she was doing, and deep down I think he was grateful she was there. I remember one night in particular, sitting with her on the porch while she cleaned her rifle. The moonlight caught the edge of the barrel as she worked in silence, and finally I asked, "Why do they keep coming?" She glanced at me briefly, then returned to her work. "Because someone out there thinks they can take what they want. Land, cattle, power, doesn't matter. They send men because they assume nobody here will fight back hard enough." Her voice was even, but I could feel the weight behind her words. "They haven't met you," I said softly. She gave a small, humorless smile. "They've met people like me. That's why they sent professionals this time." I swallowed hard, realizing that Widow wasn't just paranoid, she was expecting a bigger storm. Her instincts were sharp, honed by years of something I couldn't quite imagine, and I trusted her completely. Over the next week, I saw less of her during the day because she was spending her time scouting the perimeter, disappearing into the hills for hours at a time, only to reappear silently as if she'd been part of the landscape all along. She rarely spoke about what she found, but I noticed her tightening her patrol routes and setting up more hidden cameras. She was preparing for something bigger than a couple of hired guns. My uncle started locking the house at night, something he'd never done before, and I found myself sleeping with a loaded shotgun propped by the door. The ranch had become a fortress, and even though I hated the fear that hung in the air, I felt a strange sense of safety knowing Widow was out there, watching everything. One evening, as I carried feed to the barn, I noticed her standing motionless near the tree line, staring into the distance. The sun was setting, painting the sky in streaks of orange and red, but her expression was cold and focused. I walked over quietly, and she didn't turn as she spoke. "They're here." My breath caught. "Now." She nodded slowly, pointing to the far ridge. "2 vehicles. They parked out of sight and are moving on foot. Professional again. They're waiting for full dark." I felt my stomach drop, but Widow's calm tone steadied me. "Go back to the house," she said. "Lock every door and window. Tell your uncle to stay low." I hesitated. "What about you?" She finally turned her gaze to me, her eyes hard but not unkind. "I'll handle it." Her words carried a finality that made me shiver, but I nodded and ran back to the house. My uncle was pacing in the kitchen when I burst through the door. "What's going on?" he demanded, but before I could answer, Widow's voice crackled over the radio she'd given me earlier that week. "Stay put. Lights off." We obeyed. The house went dark, and silence settled around us. I crouched near the window, peeking out toward the ridge, but I saw nothing. Minutes dragged by like hours, every creak of the old house making my heart race. Then, faintly, I heard it, the soft crack of a rifle shot echoing through the hills. Another followed, sharper this time. My uncle tensed beside me, gripping his shotgun tightly. "She's out there alone," he muttered, his voice tight with worry. I didn't answer. Widow wasn't the type to ask for help, and I knew going out there would only put her in more danger. All we could do was wait. More shots rang out, some closer this time, and I flinched at the sound of gunfire tearing through the night. There was shouting too, voices carried faintly on the wind, but I couldn't make out the words. The ranch felt like it was holding its breath, the darkness pressing in around us. Suddenly, there was a burst of light near the far pasture, a flare, its red glow casting eerie shadows across the fields. I heard more shouting, then silence. The flare burned out, plunging everything back into darkness. The radio crackled. "Stay inside," Widow's voice said, calm and steady. "Still clearing." My uncle and I exchanged a glance, but neither of us spoke. We waited in tense silence, every second stretching longer than the last. Finally, after what felt like hours, Widow's voice came again. "All clear." I rushed to the door, but she stopped me over the radio. "Stay put. I'll come to you." 15 minutes later, she appeared in the doorway, her clothes streaked with dirt, her face expressionless. She carried 2 rifles slung over her shoulder, and her boots were muddy. "They're gone," she said simply, setting the rifles down on the table. My uncle stared at her, wide-eyed. "Gone?" She nodded. 5 of them. All hired. They won't be back." Her tone was so matter-of-fact it sent a chill through me. She'd gone out there alone against 5 armed men and won. My uncle opened his mouth to speak, but she cut him off. "We need to burn the vehicles. They parked them just over the ridge." She moved to the sink and washed her hands, the water turning reddish-brown as it swirled down the drain. I watched her in silence, my heart pounding. She'd done something extraordinary, something terrifying, and she carried it like it was nothing more than another day's work. "Who sent them?" I asked softly. She glanced at me, her expression unreadable. "Someone with money. Someone who thought this land was worth killing for." She dried her hands and slung one of the rifles over her shoulder again. "But they underestimated us." I didn't sleep that night, even after Widow assured us the danger was gone for now. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the way she'd moved through the darkness like a ghost, taking down men who had come to kill us. She wasn't just a protector, she was a warrior, forged by a life I couldn't fully understand. The next morning, the vehicles were gone, burned to husks out near the ridge. Widow stood over them, arms crossed, her expression distant. I joined her quietly, the acrid smell of smoke thick in the air. "What now?" I asked. She didn't look at me as she answered. "Now we wait. Whoever sent them will hear nothing back, and they'll either come themselves or send more." Her eyes flicked to me, sharp and determined. "But I'll be ready." In that moment, I realized she wasn't just protecting the ranch. She was fighting a war that had been chasing her long before she came here, and now it had become ours too. The days after the second attack passed in a haze of tension, each sunrise bringing with it a new sense of unease. Widow didn't say much, but she didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough to keep me and my uncle on edge, because she moved like a soldier waiting for the next battle. She patrolled the land constantly, rarely sleeping more than an hour or two at a time. Even when she was sitting on the porch drinking coffee, she wasn't really resting. Her eyes were always scanning the tree lines, her ears tuned to every creak and rustle. I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before, like the way the wind shifted before a storm, or how easily sound traveled through the stillness of the open range. Widow was teaching me without words, shaping me into someone who could survive out here if danger ever came again. And we knew it would. My uncle tried to pretend things were normal, but I could see the strain in his face. He'd built this ranch with his own 2 hands, and now strangers were trying to take it from him. Every time Widow returned from a scouting trip, he'd look up from whatever he was doing, his eyes searching her face for any sign of trouble. She'd just shake her head, and he'd go back to work, but his jaw would stay clenched. I started to feel like the ranch was holding its breath, the animals sensing it too. The cattle were restless, the horses shying at shadows. Even the dogs had grown more protective, barking at the faintest noise in the distance. It was as if the land itself knew a storm was coming. One evening, Widow came back from the hills carrying a battered duffel bag she'd found near the creek bed. She set it on the kitchen table and unzipped it, revealing rifles, ammunition, and maps. My uncle stared at it, his face pale. "They're staging out here," she said quietly. This wasn't just a hit. They were planning something bigger. She spread out one of the maps, pointing to marked locations around the ranch. "They know every trail, every fence line, every blind spot." My stomach turned as I realized just how close we'd come to losing everything. "So what do we do?" I asked, my voice low. Widow studied the map for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "We prepare. And when they come, we make sure none of them leave." Her voice was calm, but there was steel in it, and I knew she meant every word. That night, she set to work. She dug shallow trenches along the northern pasture, set up cameras and motion sensors, and created choke points along the trails that led to the ranch. She moved with quiet efficiency, her every action deliberate, like she'd done this 100 times before. I followed her, carrying supplies and tools, but mostly I just watched, trying to memorize everything she did. She wasn't just defending the ranch, she was building a battlefield. A few days later, Widow called me out to the barn. She handed me a rifle I'd never seen before, sleek and well-maintained, and taught me how to handle it. "You're going to need to know how to shoot straight," she said. Her voice was soft, but there was no trace of gentleness in her instruction. She drilled me for hours, correcting my stance, my aim, my breathing. At first, I was nervous, but under her guidance, I grew steadier. By the time the sun dipped low, I could hit targets cleanly at 100 yards. Widow gave me a rare nod of approval. "You'll do." My uncle joined us later, and she put him through the same training. He wasn't a natural shot, but he had grit, and that seemed to impress her. She wasn't just preparing us to survive, she was turning us into fighters. The transformation of the ranch continued. Widow fortified the barn doors, reinforced the house windows, and set up escape routes in case we were overrun. She even buried caches of ammunition around the property, showing me how to find them if she wasn't around. It was unnerving to see the place I'd always thought of as home turned into something out of a war zone, but I understood why. Whoever was after us wasn't going to stop. Widow knew it, and now so did I. One night, as we sat on the porch, I finally asked her the question that had been gnawing at me since she first showed up. "Why are you helping us?" She was cleaning her rifle, her hands steady as ever, but she paused for a moment before answering. "Because someone has to." She didn't look at me, just kept working on the gun. "I lost someone once. Someone who deserved to be safe, and I couldn't protect him. I don't want that to happen again." Her voice was quiet, almost flat, but I could feel the pain behind it. "Was he your husband?" I asked softly. She glanced at me, her expression unreadable. "Yes." That was all she said, but it was enough. I understood now why she carried that weight, why she never rested. She was haunted by something she couldn't change, and this was her way of making it right. I didn't push her for more. Instead, I just sat beside her in silence, the night air cool on my face, the stars scattered like diamonds above us. Widow didn't need comfort, but I hoped she felt some measure of peace in that quiet moment. The next morning, trouble came closer. Widow found tracks near the creek, fresh ones, made by boots, not animals. She crouched low, examining them carefully, then motioned for me to stay back. I watched as she followed the tracks into the trees, her movements silent and precise, like a predator stalking prey. When she returned, her expression was grim. 3 of them. Scouts. They were watching us. My heart pounded. Where are they now? Gone. For now. Her tone was flat, but I saw the flicker of tension in her eyes. They're testing us. They're getting ready. The fear that had been simmering in me for weeks boiled over into anger. Why us? Why this land? Widow studied me for a moment before answering. Because people with power think they can take what they want. And most of the time, they're right. But not this time. There was a quiet fierceness in her voice that sent a chill down my spine. That night, we didn't sleep. Widow posted us at different points around the property, our radios crackling softly as we whispered updates to each other. The darkness felt heavier than usual, every sound amplified in the stillness. I gripped my rifle tightly, my palms slick with sweat, but Widow's calm voice on the radio steadied me. Breathe. Stay low. Watch the tree line. Hours passed with no sign of movement, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Around midnight, Widow's voice came through again, sharper this time. North fence. Movement. I raised my rifle, my eyes straining in the darkness. Then I saw it, a flicker of shadow near the fence line. My heart pounded as I lined up my shot, but Widow's voice came quick. Hold. Wait for my signal. I obeyed, every muscle tense. She moved like a shadow through the grass, silent and invisible. Then, a soft whistle, her signal. A shot rang out, and a figure crumpled near the fence. Chaos erupted. More shadows appeared, gunfire cracking through the night. Widow's voice was calm but commanding over the radio. 2 more, west side. Stay low. I fired, my shot grazing one of them, and Widow finished him with a single bullet. The third man tried to retreat, but she moved like lightning, cutting him down before he made it back to the trees. The gunfire stopped, replaced by heavy silence. Clear, she said softly. My hands shook as I lowered my rifle. 3 men, just like she'd said. Scouts, testing our defenses. And now they knew exactly what they were up against. Widow returned to the porch, her face unreadable as always, but I could see the glint of something in her eyes. Determination, maybe. Or the promise of what was to come. By the next morning, the tension on the ranch had settled into something sharper, heavier. The 3 scouts Widow killed were proof that this wasn't just random aggression. They were planning something deliberate, something bigger than we had faced so far, and Widow knew it. She didn't waste words explaining. Instead, she worked from dawn until well past dusk, reinforcing every defense she had already built. She replaced the weak sections of fencing with barbed wire, hid motion sensors in the brush along the fence lines, and even buried tripwires connected to small warning flares so she'd know the exact moment someone stepped foot where they shouldn't. She moved with purpose, like someone who'd done this countless times before, and I followed her lead, helping her carry supplies, haul sandbags, and build barricades around the house. My uncle grumbled at first, muttering that the ranch looked like a military outpost, but even he didn't argue for long. The fear in his eyes betrayed him, and I could see him watching Widow with a strange mixture of awe and respect. She was relentless, never pausing for more than a sip of water before getting back to work. She didn't need to tell us that another fight was coming. We could all feel it in the air. The land was too quiet, the animals restless, the sky itself heavy with a strange kind of stillness. That evening, after hours of work, I found Widow sitting by the barn, sharpening her knife. The rhythmic sound of the blade against the whetstone was almost soothing. I sat down nearby, watching her. "Do you think they'll come tonight?" I asked. She didn't look up from her work. "Not tonight," she said. "But soon. They won't wait long. We cost them too much already." Her voice was calm, almost detached, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. "What happens if they overwhelm us?" I asked quietly. She finally looked at me, her eyes sharp and steady. "They won't." There was no hesitation in her voice, no trace of doubt. It was like she had already decided the outcome and was simply waiting for it to happen. Her confidence should have scared me, but instead, it steadied me. That night, she stationed me and my uncle at different watch points around the ranch, while she moved between us like a ghost, checking our positions and adjusting our lines of sight. I sat under the stars, my rifle across my lap, the silence so deep I could hear the rustle of grass from hundreds of feet away. Hours passed without a sound, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When dawn finally broke, we were all exhausted, but Widow seemed as alert as ever. She brewed coffee in the kitchen, her eyes scanning the horizon through the window as she sipped. My uncle slumped in a chair, his shotgun leaning against the table, and muttered, "This is no way to live." Widow didn't respond. She was already pulling out a map, marking new positions with a red pen. Her focus was absolute, like she'd been living this way for so long that she didn't know any other way to exist. Later that day, I followed her up to the ridge, where she crouched low and studied the valley below through her scope. She pointed toward a patch of forest in the distance. "They're staging there," she said. I squinted, but I couldn't see anything unusual. "How can you tell?" She handed me the scope, guiding my view to a faint trail of tire tracks cutting through the grass. "They're clever," she said softly. "But not clever enough." We returned to the ranch and began preparing for what Widow called a siege. She taught us hand signals so we wouldn't have to speak during a fight, showed us how to reload faster, and even walked us through escape plans if the house was set on fire. Her preparation was meticulous, every detail accounted for, and I realized she wasn't just protecting us, she was preparing for war. That evening, while my uncle slept, I found Widow cleaning her rifle on the porch steps. The fading sunlight cast a warm glow across her face, but her eyes were distant, like she was somewhere far away. "You've done this before," I said softly. She nodded, her hand steady as she wiped down the barrel. "Too many times." I hesitated, then asked, "Were you in the military?" She didn't answer right away. "No," she said finally. "But I worked alongside them. Different kind of war." Her voice was flat, offering no more detail, but I didn't press her. I'd learned that Widow spoke only when she wanted to, and if she wasn't ready to share, no amount of questions would make her. Still, I couldn't help but wonder what kind of life she'd led to make her so skilled, so unshakable. She looked at me then, her expression softening slightly. "Fear is good," she said quietly. "It means you're alive. But don't let it freeze you. Use it." I nodded, committing her words to memory. The next day, Widow sent me and my uncle into town with a list of supplies while she stayed behind to watch the ranch. We loaded up on everything she asked for: extra ammunition, canned food, medical supplies, batteries. When we returned hours later, the sight of her standing on the porch with her rifle raised sent my heart into my throat. She waved us down quickly, motioning for us to park the truck behind the barn. "They're close," she said the moment we stepped out. "2 scouts watching the road. Didn't engage. They're testing us again." My uncle's face turned pale. "How long do you think we have?" Widow glanced at the horizon. "A day. Maybe 2. Her calmness was terrifying. Over the next 2 days, the tension built to a breaking point. Widow barely slept, pacing the property at night like a sentinel. I followed her once, curious to see how she moved through the darkness. She was silent, almost invisible, slipping from shadow to shadow with a grace that made me wonder if she'd been trained for this. She didn't just see danger, she anticipated it, felt it in the air like a storm rolling in. On the 3rd night, it began. The first sign was a low hum in the distance, the sound of engines. Widow stiffened immediately, her hand going to her rifle. "Positions," she whispered, her voice calm but sharp. We moved quickly, taking our spots around the house. The darkness was thick, the moon hidden behind clouds, and I could barely make out shapes in the distance. Then headlights flickered briefly before being cut. My pulse thundered in my ears. Through the scope of my rifle, I saw figures moving along the fence line, crouched low. Widow's voice came over the radio, soft but steady. 7 of them. Spread out. Wait for my signal. I held my breath, my finger on the trigger. The figures moved closer, their shapes clearer now in the faint starlight. One of them raised a hand, signaling the others, and they began creeping forward. Widow's whistle cut through the night, sharp and sudden. Gunfire erupted, shattering the silence. I fired at the nearest shadow, saw him drop, and quickly shifted my aim. Widow's shots were precise and deadly, each one finding its mark. The attackers scattered, some returning fire, others diving for cover, but Widow moved like she'd been born for this moment. She shouted quick commands, her voice calm even as bullets tore through the darkness. My uncle fired from his position near the barn, his shotgun booming, and I saw one of the attackers crumple. The air was thick with smoke and gunpowder, the smell sharp in my nose. I reloaded with trembling hands, ducking low as a bullet splintered the wood beside me. Widow moved fast, her silhouette a blur as she repositioned, firing with deadly accuracy. One by one, the attackers fell, until the gunfire stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Silence settled over the ranch, heavy and suffocating. Widow's voice came through the radio, steady as ever. Clear. I exhaled shakily, my hands trembling. 7 men had come for us, and none of them had made it past the fence. Widow emerged from the shadows, her rifle slung over her shoulder, her face streaked with doubt but her expression calm. "They'll send more," she said quietly, almost to herself. "But they're running out of time." The night after the attack was eerily quiet, too quiet for comfort. Widow didn't relax even for a moment. She patrolled the perimeter again, moving like a shadow against the fence line, checking for any sign of a second wave. My uncle and I sat on the porch, rifles across our laps, the weight of what had just happened heavy on our shoulders. 7 armed men had come for us, and all of them were lying dead out in the field. Widow's efficiency was terrifying, but it was also the only reason we were still alive. She came back to the porch just before dawn, her expression as calm as if she'd gone for a simple evening stroll. She took a seat on the steps, removed the clip from her rifle, and began reloading with steady hands. "They'll regroup," she said softly, almost like she was thinking out loud. "They'll send more men, maybe heavier firepower. This was just another test. Next time, they'll come ready for war." My uncle groaned, burying his face in his hands. "This is madness," he muttered. "They're trying to take my land, and they're willing to kill us for it? Why?" Widow didn't answer immediately. She set her rifle down and reached for the knife strapped to her leg, cleaning it with a cloth. "Because someone wants this ranch badly enough to pay for blood," she said finally. "I've seen this before. Organized crews, mercenaries. They're not here on a whim. Someone with money and power is behind this, and they won't stop unless we make them." Her words hung heavy in the early morning air. The sun rose slowly over the hills, painting the landscape in orange and gold, but there was no beauty in it for us. We buried the bodies at the far edge of the property, digging shallow graves in silence. Widow didn't flinch once as she hauled the lifeless men into the earth. When we were done, she burned their weapons and gear in a pit, the smoke curling into the sky like a dark warning. "We'll need to move fast," she said, her voice low but firm. "They'll be back, and next time they'll expect us to be afraid." "Aren't you afraid?" I asked before I could stop myself. She glanced at me, her eyes hard but not unkind. "Fear doesn't help anyone," she said simply. "Preparation does." She was already planning, already setting traps in her mind for the inevitable next attack. That afternoon, she disappeared into town alone, leaving my uncle and me to hold down the ranch. She returned hours later with bags of supplies, new ammunition, and a large, unmarked crate that she hauled from the back of her truck without a word. She pried it open on the porch, revealing an array of advanced gear, night vision goggles, tactical radios, and heavier weapons than I'd ever seen up close. My uncle stared in shock. "Where in the hell did you get all this?" Widow ignored him, checking the rifle sights and loading magazines. Her movements were precise, deliberate, like she was going through a well-rehearsed routine. "We'll fortify the barn and the house," she said, glancing up at me. "They won't get past the gate next time." Over the next 24 hours, we transformed the ranch into a fortress. Widow taught us how to use every piece of equipment she'd brought, drilling us on reload times, target acquisition, and movement patterns. She installed motion-activated lights along the driveway and reinforced the front door with steel bars. She even set up a network of cameras that fed directly to a monitor in the living room. It was surreal, like something out of a war movie, but I trusted her completely. The tension built with every passing hour. The quiet was unbearable, like the calm before a storm, and Widow seemed to sense it too. On the second night after the attack, she had us all stationed at separate watchpoints again. I was in the loft of the barn, my rifle resting on a sandbag, scanning the fields through my scope. The stars were bright overhead, but the dark woods beyond the fence were a black void. I tried to steady my breathing, remembering Widow's advice to use fear rather than let it paralyze me. Just after midnight, I heard it, a low hum in the distance. I pressed my ear to the barn wall. The sound grew louder, closer. Vehicles. Multiple engines. I grabbed the radio. "They're coming," I whispered. Widow's voice crackled softly in response. "Stay calm. Wait for my mark." Through my scope, I saw headlights flicker in the distance before shutting off. Figures spilled out of the trucks, moving with practiced formation. This wasn't a ragtag group of thugs, this was a professional team. Widow's voice was calm over the radio. "Let them get closer." My pulse hammered in my chest as the figures approached the fence line. They cut through it quickly and silently, slipping into the field. Widow's whistle cut through the darkness. Flares burst into the sky, bathing the ranch in red light, and all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted, deafening in the still night. I fired at the first figure I saw, watching him crumple to the ground. Widow's shots rang out sharp and steady, each one finding a target with deadly precision. The attackers returned fire, bullets slamming into the barn walls around me, but I stayed low and kept firing, remembering every word Widow had drilled into me. My uncle's shotgun thundered from his position by the house, and Widow moved like lightning, darting from cover to cover, her rifle never missing a beat. She barked orders over the radio, her voice calm even as chaos erupted around us. Explosions rocked the ground as they tried to breach the gate with grenades, but Widow anticipated every move, driving them back with suppressive fire. I saw her take down 2 men in quick succession, her movements fluid and precise, like a machine. Hours felt like minutes, and minutes felt like hours, but finally, the gunfire slowed. The attackers were retreating, dragging their wounded back toward their trucks. Widow didn't let them go easily. She fired until they disappeared into the darkness, then lowered her rifle and scanned the field. "Hold fire," she called out. "We're clear." My body trembled as I climbed down from the loft, my ears ringing from the gunfire. The ranch was littered with shell casings, smoke still curling from spent barrels. Widow stood in the driveway, her expression unreadable, her rifle slung over her shoulder. She looked like she'd been through this 100 times before. My uncle stumbled out of his position, his face pale, his clothes streaked with dirt. They just kept coming," he whispered. Widow nodded. "They won't again." She walked past us, checking the bodies scattered across the field. There were at least a dozen men down, all dressed in tactical gear, all heavily armed. She searched them quickly, pulling radios and documents from their vests. She found what she was looking for in the pocket of one of the men, a folded piece of paper with coordinates and a name scribbled across the top. She stared at it for a long moment, then slipped it into her jacket. "It's over for tonight," she said quietly. "But I know where this ends." The next morning, Widow packed a small bag and loaded up her truck. My uncle tried to stop her, demanding to know where she was going, but she only said, "To finish this." She left without another word, her truck kicking up dust as it disappeared down the dirt road. We never saw her again after that night, but word traveled fast. A few weeks later, there were news reports about a raid on a heavily fortified estate owned by a powerful businessman accused of illegal land grabs. The estate had been burned to the ground, the man dead, and all his mercenaries gone. No one knew who had done it. No one but us. The attacks on the ranch stopped. The fence was repaired, the cameras taken down, and life slowly returned to normal. But I never forgot the way Widow moved through the darkness, the way she turned fear into a weapon, and the way she vanished after delivering justice. She was a ghost, a legend, and for a brief time, she was our guardian. The end.